My unemployed daughter-in-law won $8 million in the lottery. That's when she kicked my son and me out of the house and said, "You're useless now. I don't need you anymore." I let out a laugh that could cut like a knife. "Did you even read the name on the ticket, dear? I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I never thought the sound of my own front door slamming would mark the end of everything I thought I knew about my family. But there I was, standing on the porch of the house I'd called home for 3 years, my suitcase at my feet, staring at wood that suddenly felt foreign to my touch. "You heard me right, Faye." Yara's voice cut through the evening air like broken glass. "Pack your things and get out, both of you." My son Judd stood beside me, his face pale as winter snow. Neither of us moved. We couldn't. The words hanging in the air seemed impossible, like someone speaking a language we didn't understand. "Yara, what are you talking about?" Judd's voice cracked like he was 13 again, asking me why his father had left us. "This is our home." She laughed. Actually laughed. It was a sound I'd never heard from her before, sharp and cold, nothing like the sweet giggles she used to make when I brought her coffee in bed every morning for the past 3 years. "Your home?" She held up a piece of paper, waving it like a victory flag. "This lottery ticket just made me $8 million richer. 8 million, Judd. Do you know what that means?" I felt my knees go weak. The lottery ticket. I remembered her buying it last Tuesday at the gas station while I pumped gas into my car. She'd been complaining about not having money for groceries again, and I'd given her a $20 bill, just like I'd done hundreds of times before. "It means I don't need you anymore, either of you." Her eyes landed on me with a hatred so pure it took my breath away. "Especially you, old woman. You think I don't know how you look at me? Like I'm some charity case you picked up off the street?" "Yara, stop." Judd stepped forward, his hands shaking. "Mom has done everything for us. She sold her house so we could afford this place. She's been paying the mortgage, the utilities, buying groceries." "Exactly." Yara's voice rose to a shriek. "She's been controlling us with her money, making us feel guilty, making us dependent on her. Well, guess what? I'm nobody's charity case anymore." I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "I never made you feel like charity. I helped because you're family." "Family?" She stepped closer, close enough that I could see the mascara smearing under her eyes from tears of rage. "You want to know what I really think about family, Faye? You're a bitter old woman who couldn't stand seeing her son happy with someone else. You moved in here to spy on us, to control us, to make sure I never felt like this was really my home." Each word hit me like a physical blow. I thought about all the mornings I'd woken up early to make breakfast before she got up. All the times I'd taken care of her 2 kids from her previous relationship while she slept in until noon. All the job interviews I'd driven her to, waiting in parking lots for hours while she went through the motions of looking for work she never intended to take. That's not true. My voice was stronger now, but my hands were trembling. "I moved in because you asked me to." "You said you needed help with the kids, with the bills. I said what I needed to say to survive," Yara screamed. "Do you think I wanted to depend on you? Do you think I enjoyed having you watch my every move, judge everything I did? I played the game because I had to. But now?" She waved the ticket again. "Now I don't have to pretend anymore." Judd looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "You were pretending? This whole time?" "Oh, grow up, Judd." Yara's voice turned cold, almost bored. "Did you really think I love sitting around this house all day, listening to your mother's stories about her job, her friends, her perfect life before we ruined it? Did you think I enjoyed family dinners where she'd make little comments about how I should be looking harder for work?" "I never said that," I whispered. But even as the words left my mouth, I wondered if they were true. Had I been making comments? Had I been judging her without realizing it? "You didn't have to say it." Yara's laugh was bitter now. "It was in every look, every sigh when you paid another bill, every time you'd volunteer to take the kids somewhere because you thought I wasn't doing enough." I felt something breaking inside my chest. Not my heart exactly, but something deeper. Something that had taken 66 years to build and was crumbling in minutes. "Yara, please." Judd's voice was desperate now. "Even if you feel that way about Mom, what about us? What about our marriage? She turned to him with an expression I'd never seen her wear before, cold, calculating, like she was looking at a stranger. What about it, Judd? You think I don't know you only married me because I was pregnant? You think I don't know you felt trapped? She shook her head. I was trapped too. Trapped with a man who still runs to his mommy every time there's a problem. Trapped pretending to be grateful to a woman who made me feel like a burden every single day. That's enough. The words came out of me with a force that surprised everyone, including myself. You want us gone? Fine. But don't you dare rewrite history to make yourself feel better about this betrayal. Yara's eyes narrowed. Betrayal? You want to talk about betrayal? How about the way you've controlled this household since day one? How about the way you made me feel like a guest in my own home? This was never your home. The words exploded out of me before I could stop them. I bought this house. I pay the mortgage. I pay for everything while you sit around making excuses about why you can't work. And there it is. Yara's smile was triumphant. The real Faye, the one who's been keeping score this whole time. Well, congratulations, Faye. You just proved my point. I felt like I was drowning. Everything I'd done, every sacrifice I'd made, was being twisted into something ugly and manipulative. How had helping my family turned me into the villain? Mom, Judd said quietly, and when I looked at him, I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach drop. Doubt. Don't look at me like that, I whispered. Please don't tell me you believe this. He opened his mouth, then closed it, opened it again. I don't know what to believe anymore. Those 7 words finished what Yara had started. I felt something inside me just stop. Stop fighting. Stop explaining. Stop hoping. Fine. I picked up my suitcase. My hands steadier now than they'd been all night. I'll go. But Judd, when you realize what you've lost today, don't come looking for me. As I walked toward my car, I heard Yara call out behind me, her voice sweet as poison. Drive safe, Faye, and don't forget to take your guilt trips with you. The last thing I heard was the sound of my front door closing, not slamming this time, just closing. Final and absolute, like the end of a life I'd thought would last forever. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, my hands still gripping the steering wheel though I'd been parked for 20 minutes. The engine was off, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside. I couldn't bring myself to face the reality that I had nowhere else to go. My phone buzzed. A text from my neighbor, Margaret. Saw you leaving with suitcases. Everything okay? I stared at the message until the words blurred. How do you explain that your entire life just collapsed in the span of 15 minutes? How do you tell someone that the family you sacrificed everything for just threw you away like yesterday's newspaper? Instead of answering, I found myself scrolling through my photo gallery, stopping at a picture from 3 years ago. Judd and Yara's wedding day. There I was, beaming beside them, wearing the blue dress I'd bought special for the occasion. I remembered feeling so hopeful that day, so grateful that my son had found someone who seemed to love him. But looking at the photo now, I noticed things I'd missed before. How Yara's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. How she stood just slightly apart from Judd and me, like she was already planning her escape. I should have seen it coming. The signs were all there. It started 2 months after their wedding. Yara showed up at my apartment, tears streaming down her face, holding her 2-year-old daughter Emma while her 4-year-old son Marcus clung to her leg. Faye, I'm so sorry to bother you, she'd said, her voice shaking, but my landlord is evicting us. I can't afford the rent anymore and I have nowhere else to go. Of course, I'd invited her in, made her tea. Let the kids play with the toys I kept for when they visited. She'd explained that she'd lost her job at the retail store because they were cutting hours, and childcare was so expensive that it didn't make sense to take just any job. I know it's a lot to ask, she'd said, looking so young and vulnerable sitting on my couch. But could we stay here for just a few weeks? Just until I get back on my feet? A few weeks turned into 2 months. Then Judd started spending every night at my place to be with his new family. My 1-bedroom apartment became cramped and chaotic, filled with crying kids and the tension of too many people in too small a space. That's when Yara had the brilliant idea. You know, she'd said one evening after the kids were finally asleep, It's really not fair that you're stuck in this tiny apartment when you could have a real home. With your savings and my good credit, we could get a beautiful house together. A real home for all of us. It made sense at the time. I'd been living in that cramped apartment for 5 years, ever since the divorce settlement ran out. I had money saved from my job at the insurance company, enough for a substantial down payment. And the idea of having a real home again, a place where I could watch my grandchildren grow up, was too tempting to resist. The house was perfect. 4 bedrooms, a big backyard, a kitchen with enough space for family dinners. The mortgage payments were steep, but manageable with my salary. Yara promised she'd find work once we were settled, once the kids were in a good school district. "This is going to be wonderful," she'd said, standing in the empty living room on move-in day. "A fresh start for all of us." For the first few months, it really did feel wonderful. I'd come home from work to find Yara making dinner, the kids doing homework at the kitchen table, Judd relaxing on the couch after his shift at the warehouse. It felt like the family I'd always wanted but never quite had. But slowly, things began to change. The job search became increasingly half-hearted. Yara would sleep until 10 or 11, then spend hours on her phone, claiming she was looking at job listings. When I'd ask about interviews, there was always a reason why she couldn't take the position. The hours weren't right. The pay was too low. They didn't understand that she needed flexibility for the kids. "It's harder than you think," she'd say when I'd gently suggest she might need to be less picky. "You've been at the same job for 20 years. You don't understand what the job market is like now." So I stopped asking, started working overtime to cover the increasing expenses. Groceries, utilities, school supplies, kids' clothes. The list kept growing, and my paycheck kept shrinking. Then came the emergencies. Marcus needed glasses. Emma had an ear infection that required expensive antibiotics. The car broke down and needed major repairs. Each crisis felt urgent, necessary, and I found myself dipping into my savings again and again. "I promise I'll pay you back," Yara would say each time. And I believed her. She seemed genuinely grateful, genuinely embarrassed about needing help. She'd hug me tight and tell me what a blessing I was, what a wonderful mother-in-law, what a saint. I lived for those moments. After years of feeling useless and discarded, having someone depend on me felt good. It felt like purpose. The morning routine became sacred to me. I'd wake up at 5:30 to make breakfast for everyone before work. Scrambled eggs for Judd, pancakes for the kids, coffee with 2 sugars for Yara, who was never a morning person. I'd pack lunches, make sure homework was in backpacks, and somehow still get to work on time. "You don't have to do all this," Yara would say, but she never offered to help, never suggested taking turns. And when I'd hint that maybe she could handle breakfast sometimes, she'd remind me how hard it was for her to function in the mornings, how she'd never been a breakfast person, how much the kids loved my cooking. Weekends were for grocery shopping, cleaning, doing laundry. Yara would disappear for hours, claiming she needed alone time to decompress from the stress of job hunting. I'd find myself watching both kids, cooking dinner, maintaining the house I was paying for while she got pedicures or met friends for coffee. "I need this," she'd explain when she'd come home refreshed and relaxed. "If I don't take care of my mental health, I'll never be able to function well enough to find a job." It always sounded reasonable. Everything about Yara sounded reasonable when she explained it. She had a way of making her needs seem urgent, and my concerns seem petty. The breaking point should have been last Christmas. I'd spent weeks planning, shopping, cooking for the extended family gathering we'd decided to host. Yara had promised to help with the preparations, but the morning of the party, she woke up with a migraine. "I'm so sorry," she'd said, barely lifting her head from the pillow. "I think it's stress. You know how these family things make me anxious." So I'd handled everything alone, cooking for 12 people, setting up, serving, cleaning up afterward while she stayed in bed. When her sister Carol complimented the meal, Yara had somehow made her way downstairs, looking perfectly refreshed, and accepted the praise like she'd done half the work. "Faye and I make such a good team," she'd said, wrapping her arm around my shoulders. "I don't know what I'd do without her." And I'd felt proud, useful, like I was exactly where I belonged. Now, sitting in this diner parking lot with everything I owned in my back seat, I could see how perfectly she'd played me. Every crisis, every emergency, every moment of vulnerability had been carefully calculated to keep me giving, keep me believing I was needed, keep me from asking the hard questions. The worst part wasn't the money. It wasn't even the betrayal. It was realizing that for 3 years, I'd been living a lie. Every family dinner, every shared laugh, every quiet moment when I'd felt grateful for this second chance at family life had been built on manipulation so skilled I'd never even seen it coming. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Judd. "Mom, where are you? We need to talk." I stared at the message for a long time before turning off my phone. Whatever Judd wanted to say, I wasn't ready to hear it. Not tonight. Not until I figured out how to rebuild a life that had just been demolished by the very people I'd trusted most. I'd been living in the Comfort Inn for 5 days when I ran into Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store. She'd been my neighbor for 3 years, the kind of woman who always knew everyone's business but somehow made it feel like genuine concern rather than nosiness. "Faye." Her voice carried that particular tone people use when they're not quite sure if they should be offering sympathy or congratulations. "I heard about your good fortune." I paused in the cereal aisle, a box of oatmeal in my hand. "My what?" "The lottery win, dear. Yara told everyone at the neighborhood association meeting. $8 million. Can you imagine?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes were bright with excitement. "She said you were so generous to give them the house and move into a nice hotel while you look for a place that's more suited to your new lifestyle." The box of oatmeal slipped from my fingers and hit the floor with a dull thud. "She said what?" "Oh, I hope I haven't spoiled some kind of surprise." Mrs. Patterson looked suddenly worried. "She seemed so proud when she told us how you'd decided to give them their independence now that money wasn't an issue anymore. Such a thoughtful mother-in-law," she said. "Always putting family first." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What exactly did she tell you?" Mrs. Patterson shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing she'd stepped into something she didn't understand. "Well, she said you'd won the lottery and decided to give them the house as a gift so they could finally feel like it was truly theirs. She was so emotional about it, saying how grateful she was that you'd been so selfless all these years, and now everyone could be happy and independent." The grocery store seemed to tilt around me. Yara hadn't just stolen my home and my family. She'd stolen my reputation, rewriting the story to make herself look like the grateful recipient of my generosity instead of the manipulative woman who'd thrown me out with nowhere to go. "She said you were looking at condos in Florida," Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice growing smaller as she watched my expression. "Said you'd always talked about retiring somewhere warm." I'd never mentioned Florida, not once. But it was exactly the kind of detail that would make the story believable, the kind of lie that would explain why a 66-year-old woman would suddenly disappear from her neighborhood. "Faye, are you all right? You look very pale." I bent down to pick up the oatmeal, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the box. "I'm fine, just tired." But I wasn't fine. As I finished my shopping in a daze, I realized that Yara had done something far more devastating than simply kicking me out. She'd created a narrative that made her look like the victim of my overwhelming generosity, a story that painted me as the wealthy woman who'd finally decided to let the poor young family stand on their own feet. It was brilliant, really, and absolutely devastating. That evening, I got a call from my sister Janet in Phoenix. We'd never been particularly close, but we checked in with each other every few months. "Faye, I just got off the phone with cousin Linda, and she said she heard from Margaret that you'd won the lottery. Is that true? Why didn't you call me?" I closed my eyes, sitting on the edge of the hotel bed that had become my entire world. "Janet, that's not what happened." "What do you mean?" "Linda said your daughter-in-law posted something on Facebook about how grateful she was for your generosity, how you'd given them the house and were starting a new chapter in your life. Posted on Facebook. Of course she had." Yara was making sure the story spread far and wide, cementing her version of events in the minds of everyone who knew us. "Can you see the post?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "I'm not on Facebook, but Linda read it to me. It sounded so sweet, Faye. She talked about what a wonderful mother-in-law you've been, how you'd supported them through hard times, and how excited she was that you could finally enjoy your winnings without worrying about anyone else. I felt sick. Yara had taken every genuine moment of our relationship and weaponized it against me. Every sacrifice I'd made, every bill I'd paid, every time I'd put their needs before my own was being reframed as the actions of a wealthy woman who'd finally decided to stop playing benefactor. "Janet, I need you to listen to me carefully," I said. "I didn't win the lottery. Yara did, and she kicked me out of the house I'd been paying for. I'm living in a hotel." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Janet? Faye, that doesn't make sense. Why would Linda make up something like that? And why would your daughter-in-law lie on Facebook? Because she's covering up what she really did." Another long pause. "Honey, are you feeling all right? Are you sure you're not confused about something?" Even my own sister didn't believe me. Yara's story was so much more palatable than the truth. Who wants to believe that a young mother would be so cruel to the elderly woman who'd supported her family? Who wants to think that someone could be that calculating, that manipulative? The lies were easier to swallow than the reality. Over the next few days, I started noticing the looks. The grocery store clerk who'd always been friendly was suddenly distant. The woman at the dry cleaner, who used to chat about her grandchildren, barely made eye contact. Word was spreading through the community, and I wasn't the hero of the story. Margaret finally called me directly on Thursday evening. "Faye, I'm confused. I've been hearing different versions of what happened with you and Yara, and I don't know what to believe." I felt a small spark of hope. "What have you heard?" "Well, Yara came by yesterday to ask if I could help her with something. She was crying, saying she felt terrible about how things had gone with you moving out. She said you'd been so generous with the lottery money, but that there had been some tension because she and Judd wanted to feel more independent." The hope died as quickly as it had appeared. "She said you'd been hurt that they didn't want you to stay and help manage the money, that you'd taken it as rejection when really they just wanted to prove they could handle things on their own." Margaret's voice was careful, like she was trying not to take sides. "She asked me to check on you, to make sure you were okay, because she was worried you might be feeling abandoned." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her I'd seen you leaving with suitcases and that you'd looked upset. She started crying harder and said she felt awful, that maybe they'd handled it wrong, but that they'd been so overwhelmed by the money and the attention that they'd made some poor decisions." I closed my eyes. Yara was covering all her bases, making sure that even the neighbors who might have witnessed my distress would understand it as the hurt feelings of a generous woman who'd been gently asked to step back. "Margaret, I need you to know the truth. I didn't win any lottery. I've been paying for that house for 3 years. Yara won the money and threw me out because she didn't need me anymore." The silence on the other end was deafening. "Faye," Margaret said finally, her voice gentle but skeptical, "that's a very serious accusation. Are you sure you're not maybe misunderstanding something? Maybe there was a miscommunication about the money?" "There was no miscommunication. She told me exactly what she thought of me and exactly why she didn't need me anymore. But honey, why would she go to the trouble of making up such an elaborate story about your generosity? Why not just say you'd had a fight?" Because Yara understood something I was only beginning to grasp. The truth made her look like a monster, but her version made her look like a victim of my overwhelming generosity, a young woman struggling to find her independence in the shadow of a wealthy mother-in-law who couldn't let go. Her story explained away every strange detail. Why I was living in a hotel instead of a luxury condo. Why I looked upset instead of celebratory. Why I'd left so suddenly without saying goodbye to longtime neighbors. In Yara's version, I was the difficult rich relative who'd taken offense at their desire for independence. I was the controlling woman who couldn't accept that they didn't need my help anymore. And the most devastating part was that people wanted to believe her story, because it was easier than accepting that someone they'd known and liked could be capable of such cruelty. Because it preserved their faith in human nature to believe that family disputes were just misunderstandings that would work themselves out. As I lay in my hotel bed that night, listening to the traffic outside my window, I realized that Yara had done more than steal my money and my home. She'd stolen my truth. She'd made it impossible for me to tell my story without sounding bitter, delusional, or vengeful. She'd trapped me in a narrative where I was either a generous woman who should be grateful for the family's independence, or a crazy old lady making up wild stories about the sweet young mother who'd always been so appreciative of my help. And the worst part was, I was starting to wonder if anyone would ever believe me when I figured out how to prove what really happened. The hotel room had become my entire world, and in the silence of those four walls, memories I'd been avoiding started flooding back with painful clarity. It was as if losing everything had torn away the protective filter I'd been using to view my life, and now I could see patterns that had been invisible when I was living them. I kept thinking about the first time I'd met Yara. Judd had been so nervous, picking at his fingernails the way he used to do as a child when he was worried about disappointing me. "Mom, there's someone I want you to meet," he'd said over dinner at our usual restaurant. "Her name is Yara, and she's special." The way he'd said special should have been my first clue. Not special, like wonderful or amazing. Special like fragile, like something that needed to be handled with care. When he'd brought her to my apartment the following week, I'd been immediately struck by how young she looked. At 26, she was 8 years younger than Judd, but something about her made her seem even younger than that. Maybe it was the way she'd stayed slightly behind him as they walked in, or how she'd barely made eye contact when we were introduced. "It's so nice to finally meet you, Mrs. Holloway," she'd said, her voice soft and sweet. "Judd talks about you all the time." She'd been wearing a simple summer dress that looked like it might have come from a thrift store, and she'd kept her hands folded in her lap throughout the entire visit. When I'd offered her coffee, she'd asked for water instead. When I'd suggested ordering pizza for dinner, she'd insisted she wasn't very hungry. Everything about her had screamed, "Poor girl trying not to be a burden," and my heart had gone out to her immediately. Judd had filled in her story during that first visit, while Yara sat quietly, occasionally nodding or adding a small detail. She'd gotten pregnant young, married the father who turned out to be abusive, divorced him when the kids were tiny. She'd been struggling to make ends meet ever since, working retail jobs when she could find childcare, living in a series of cheap apartments. "She's been through so much, Mom," Judd had said, and the way he'd looked at her was like she was made of spun glass. "But she's the strongest person I know. I'd wanted to like her. More than that, I'd wanted to protect her." Here was this young woman who'd clearly had a hard life, who'd been let down by the men who should have taken care of her, and my son was looking at her like she hung the moon. But even then, something had felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a sense that the story was almost too perfect. The struggling single mother, the abusive ex-husband, the two beautiful children who needed stability. It was like a movie script designed to trigger every maternal instinct I had. I'd pushed those doubts away, telling myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I was just threatened by another woman coming into Judd's life. Maybe I was worried about losing my place as the most important woman in his world. The second time I'd met her, she'd been a different person entirely. Confident, chatty, full of opinions about everything from the restaurant we'd chosen to the movie we'd seen afterward. She'd talked about her dreams of going back to school, maybe studying interior design or early childhood education. "I just want to make something of myself," she'd said, her eyes bright with ambition. "I want my kids to be proud of me, you know?" It was exactly what any mother would want to hear her son's girlfriend say. She had goals, dreams, a desire to better herself. She wasn't just looking for a man to take care of her. But looking back now, I realized that was the last time I'd ever heard her talk about her own ambitions. Once she'd moved in with Judd, once she'd gotten pregnant and they'd decided to get married, all that talk of school and careers had simply evaporated. The engagement had been a whirlwind. One month she was the independent woman with big dreams, and the next she was calling me in tears because she'd discovered she was pregnant, and Judd had proposed, but she was scared about money, and what if they couldn't afford a wedding? And what if she couldn't be a good enough wife? Of course, I'd stepped in to help with wedding planning. Of course, I'd offered to pay for the flowers when their budget got tight. Of course, I'd volunteered to watch the kids while she dealt with morning sickness. Every crisis had been perfectly timed, perfectly designed to pull on my heartstrings and open my wallet. The morning sickness had been particularly effective. Yara would call me at work, her voice weak and shaky, apologizing for bothering me but explaining that she felt too sick to handle the kids, and Judd was at work and she didn't know what to do. I'd started using my lunch breaks to drive over and help. I'd bring soup, take the kids to the park, clean up the apartment while she rested. I'd felt so useful, so needed. Here was a young woman who trusted me enough to ask for help, who saw me as family even before she officially was. "I don't know what I would do without you," she'd tell me, tears in her eyes. "You're like the mother I never had." Those words had meant everything to me. After Judd's father had left, after years of feeling like I'd failed at marriage, like I'd somehow not been enough, having someone need me that way had felt like redemption. The pattern had been established so early, so subtly, that I'd never recognized it as manipulation. Yara would have a crisis, I would solve it, and she would be so grateful that I'd feel like the most important person in her world. Then there would be a brief period of calm before the next emergency arose. Her car would break down the day before a job interview. The babysitter would cancel at the last minute when she had plans. The kids would get sick just when she'd started feeling confident about something. And I'd always been there, always ready to help, to fix, to make everything better. Even the pregnancy had followed the same pattern. At first, everything had been fine. Then suddenly she was having complications, stress-related problems that required bed rest. Of course, someone needed to take care of the other kids. Of course, someone needed to handle the doctor's appointments and grocery shopping. "I feel so guilty asking you to do all this," she'd say. But she'd ask anyway. And I'd do it anyway, because what kind of person would I be if I let a pregnant woman and 2 small children suffer when I had the ability to help? The manipulation had been so gentle, so loving, that it had felt like family devotion rather than exploitation. Every time I'd questioned whether I was doing too much, Yara would have another moment of vulnerability that reminded me why she needed me. She'd cry about how hard it was to be pregnant while caring for 2 kids. She'd worry about whether Judd really loved her or just felt obligated to marry her. She'd confess her fears about not being a good enough mother, about her children growing up without stability the way she had, and I'd reassure her, support her, promise her that she wasn't alone in this, that she had family now, that I would always be there for her. Looking back, I could see how perfectly she'd played me. She'd studied my vulnerabilities and exploited them with surgical precision. My fear of being useless, my guilt about Judd's difficult childhood after his father left, my desperate desire to be needed, to matter, to be the kind of mother and grandmother who made a difference in people's lives. She'd given me exactly what I'd thought I wanted: a daughter who needed me, grandchildren who depended on me, a chance to be the maternal figure I'd always believed I was meant to be. But it had all been performance. Every tear, every crisis, every moment of gratitude had been carefully calculated to keep me giving more and more of myself, while she gave nothing in return. The worst part was realizing how many opportunities I'd had to see the truth. The way she'd never followed through on any plan that would have made her less dependent on me. The way her emergencies always seemed to coincide with moments when I might have pulled back or expected more from her. The way she'd gradually isolated me from other relationships by creating constant crises that required my attention. I'd stopped having lunch with my work friends because I was always rushing over to help Yara with something. I'd given up my book club because Wednesday evenings had become my regular babysitting night. I'd canceled weekend plans countless times because Yara was feeling overwhelmed and needed support. Slowly, methodically, she'd made herself the center of my world while making sure I remained nothing more than a resource in hers. And now, sitting in this hotel room with nothing but a suitcase full of clothes and a bank account that would last maybe 2 months, I finally understood the scope of what had been done to me. Yara hadn't just taken my money. She'd taken 3 years of my life, 3 years I'd spent believing I was building something meaningful with my family. She'd taken my sense of purpose, my confidence in my own judgment, my faith in my ability to tell the difference between genuine love and skilled manipulation. She'd made me complicit in my own exploitation by making me feel good about it every step of the way. It was the 3rd week of living in that hotel room when I finally decided I had to go back to the house to get my tax documents. I'd been putting it off, dreading the confrontation, but my accountant needed them for my retirement planning, and I couldn't afford to delay filing any longer. I drove past the house twice before working up the courage to park. Everything looked the same from the outside. The garden I'd planted last spring was blooming beautifully. The porch swing I'd bought at a garage sale was still there, though no one seemed to be using it. Yara answered the door wearing a silk robe I'd never seen before. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she was wearing makeup even though it was barely 10 in the morning. Faye. She didn't seem surprised to see me. What do you want? I need to get my tax documents from my room. My W-2s, investment statements. They're in the filing cabinet. She looked at me for a long moment, then stepped aside. Make it quick. I have people coming over later. The house felt different, not just because I no longer belonged there, but because things had changed. There was a new expensive coffee machine on the kitchen counter. Designer shopping bags were scattered across the dining room table. Through the window, I could see a brand new SUV in the driveway. Nice car, I said, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. Judd needed reliable transportation for work, Yara replied, not meeting my eyes. I climbed the stairs to what had been my room for 3 years. It was completely empty now, stripped of every trace that I'd ever lived there. The filing cabinet was gone. Where are my files? I called down the stairs. What files? I came back down, my heart starting to race. My filing cabinet, all my financial documents. Where did you put them? Yara shrugged. I don't know what you're talking about. There wasn't any filing cabinet in there when I cleaned out the room. Yara, that cabinet had 20 years of financial records. Tax returns, investment statements, insurance policies. You can't just throw away someone's financial documents. I didn't throw away anything that belonged to you. Maybe you're confused about where you kept things. I felt that familiar rage building in my chest, but this time it was mixed with panic. Those documents weren't just paperwork. They were proof of everything I'd paid for, every transaction, every sacrifice I'd made for this family. I want to look around, I said. Those files have to be somewhere. No, Yara's voice was firm. You don't live here anymore. You can't just wander around my house going through my things. Your house? The words came out sharper than I'd intended. I've been paying the mortgage on this house for 3 years. That was your choice. Nobody forced you to pay for anything. I stared at her, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. The sweet, vulnerable young woman was completely gone. In her place was someone cold, calculating, and utterly without remorse. I need those documents, Yara. If you threw them away, I need to know so I can request duplicates from my bank and employer. I told you I don't know anything about any documents, but something in her voice, a slight hesitation, made me look at her more carefully. She was lying. She knew exactly what had happened to my files. Fine, I said. I'll contact my attorney about getting copies of everything. For just a moment, I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not fear exactly, but concern. I left without another word, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important I was missing. Something about the way she'd reacted when I mentioned getting copies of my financial records. That evening, I called my bank to request statements for the past 3 years. It was a tedious process, but I needed to rebuild my financial records anyway for tax purposes. Mrs. Holloway, the customer service representative said, I see you've had quite a bit of activity on your accounts recently. Would you like me to include the lottery deposit from last Tuesday? I nearly dropped the phone. I'm sorry, what deposit? The deposit for $47,000 on Tuesday, March 15th. The notation says it's lottery winnings. My hands started shaking. Can you tell me more about that deposit? Where did it come from? It shows as a direct deposit from the California State Lottery Commission. Would you like me to email you the details? Yes, please. Right away. I hung up and stared at my phone, my mind racing. A lottery deposit. In my account. On Tuesday. The email arrived within minutes, and when I opened the attachment, everything became clear. The deposit was for $47,000 and change. The notation indicated it was the after-tax proceeds from a lottery ticket, purchased at Murphy's gas station on Elm Street. The ticket number was listed, along with the date of purchase. March 1st, the day I'd given Yara $20 to buy gas while I pumped. But that wasn't the most important detail. The most important detail was in the account information section. The winning ticket had been purchased using my debit card. I stared at the document, reading it over and over again. Yara had bought the ticket with my money, using my card, which meant legally the ticket belonged to me, but she'd claimed the $8 million prize. How was that possible? I called the Lottery Commission's customer service line, working my way through automated menus until I reached a human being. I need to verify some information about a winning ticket, I told the representative. I believe there may have been an error in the claim process. I can help you with that. Can you provide me with the ticket number? I read the number from my bank statement. I see the ticket here. It was claimed on March 20th by... There was a pause. By Yara Holloway. Are you related to the claimant? She's my daughter-in-law. But the ticket was purchased with my debit card from my account. Do you have records of that? Another pause. Ma'am, I'm showing that the ticket was purchased with a debit card ending in 7842. Is that your card? Yes, it is. Well, that's unusual. Typically, whoever possesses the physical ticket is considered the owner, regardless of how it was purchased. But if you're saying the ticket was bought with your card without your permission, no, she had permission to use my card for gas, but I don't think she had permission to claim lottery winnings on a ticket purchased with my money. Ma'am, this sounds like it might be a legal matter. The ticket was claimed in good faith, but if there's a dispute about ownership based on how it was purchased, you might want to consult with an attorney. I hung up and sat in the hotel room, staring at the documents spread across the bed. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than despair. I felt hope. Yara had made a mistake. In her eagerness to claim the prize money, she'd overlooked the fact that the ticket was purchased with my card from my account. She'd assumed that possession of the physical ticket was all that mattered, but the law might see it differently. Especially if I could prove that the $20 used to purchase the ticket came from my account, and that Yara had no legal right to claim winnings from a ticket she hadn't actually paid for. I thought about the $47,000 that had been deposited into my account. Clearly, the Lottery Commission had initially tried to pay the winnings to the account associated with the card used for purchase. But somehow, Yara had redirected the larger prize to herself. The next morning, I called 3 different attorneys before finding one who specialized in lottery disputes. Martin Greenberg's office was in downtown, and he agreed to see me that afternoon. This is an interesting case, he said after reviewing the documents I'd brought. The law is actually pretty clear about lottery ticket ownership. If someone purchases a ticket with funds that belong to another person, without that person's knowledge or consent for the specific purchase, the ticket legally belongs to the person whose money was used. But she had permission to use my card. For gas, did you give her specific permission to buy lottery tickets? I thought back to that day. No. I gave her $20 and told her to put it toward gas. I never said anything about lottery tickets. Then you have a case. The question is whether we can prove that the ticket was purchased without your specific consent, and whether we can demonstrate that your daughter-in-law knowingly claimed winnings that legally belonged to you. He leaned back in his chair. Tell me about your relationship with her. Has she ever used your money for other purposes without asking? For the next hour, I told him everything. The mortgage payments, the utilities, the groceries, the constant emergencies that always seemed to require my financial intervention. The more I talked, the more interested he became. Mrs. Holloway, he said finally, I think you may have more than just a lottery dispute here. What you're describing sounds like a pattern of financial exploitation. Combined with the lottery ticket issue, we might be looking at fraud charges. For the first time in a month, I smiled. A real smile. How long do you think this will take? That depends on how quickly your daughter-in-law wants to settle. Because I have a feeling she's not going to want this going to court. 3 weeks after hiring Martin Greenberg, I was sitting in his office while he made the call that would change everything. I'd insisted on being there when he contacted Yara's attorney, wanting to hear her reaction firsthand. This is Martin Greenberg representing Faye Holloway, he said into the speakerphone. I believe your client has some documents that belong to my client. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional. Mr. Greenberg, my client has already told Mrs. Holloway that she doesn't have any documents belonging to her. That's interesting, because we have a court order to examine the contents of the filing cabinet that was removed from Mrs. Holloway's room, the one your client claimed didn't exist. Silence on the other end. Martin smiled at me and continued. We also have some questions about a lottery ticket purchased with Mrs. Holloway's debit card on March 1st. Your client claimed the winnings from that ticket. We'd like to discuss the legal implications of that. I'll need to speak with my client and get back to you. Of course. But I should mention that we're prepared to file both civil and criminal charges if we can't resolve this matter quickly. Lottery fraud is a felony, as I'm sure you know. The call ended, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Satisfaction. How long do you think before we hear back? I asked. Not long. Nobody wants a lottery fraud case going to trial. Too much publicity, too much risk. He was right. Yara's attorney called back within 2 hours. My client is willing to discuss a settlement. The meeting was set for the following Friday at Martin's office. I spent the week preparing myself emotionally for seeing Yara again, knowing that this time would be different. This time, I had evidence. This time, I had power. When Yara walked into the conference room, I barely recognized her. Gone was the expensive silk robe and designer makeup. She looked exhausted, scared, and much older than her 31 years. Judd was with her, his face pale and drawn. They sat across from Martin and me, and for a moment, nobody spoke. Finally, Martin broke the silence. Let's start with the lottery ticket. Mrs. Holloway has bank records showing that the winning ticket was purchased with her debit card, using funds from her account. Your client claimed winnings from a ticket she didn't legally own. Yara's attorney, a nervous-looking man named Richards, shifted uncomfortably. My client was given permission to use the card. For gas, Martin replied smoothly, not for gambling. Mrs. Holloway never consented to lottery ticket purchases, which means the ticket legally belonged to her. He slid a document across the table. This is a statement from the Lottery Commission confirming that the initial payout was attempted to Mrs. Holloway's account, which is where smaller winnings automatically go when a ticket is purchased with a registered card. Your client then contacted them claiming there had been an error and redirected the larger prize to herself. I watched Yara's face crumble as the implications sank in. But that's not all, Martin continued. We've also been examining Mrs. Holloway's financial records for the past 3 years. Would you like to see what we found? He opened a thick folder and began laying out bank statements, mortgage records, utility bills. Mrs. Holloway paid $247,000 in mortgage payments for a house where she wasn't on the deed. She paid $18,000 in utility bills, $31,000 in grocery bills for a family of 5, $12,000 in medical expenses for children who weren't legally her responsibility. The numbers kept coming, each one landing like a physical blow. I'd known I'd been supporting them, but seeing it all laid out like this, the scope of my financial contribution was staggering. In total, Mrs. Holloway invested $342,000 in supporting your client's family over 3 years. And when your client no longer needed that support, she not only terminated the relationship but also stole lottery winnings that legally belonged to Mrs. Holloway. Yara started crying. Not the manipulative tears I'd seen so many times before, but the desperate sobs of someone whose world was collapsing. I didn't know, she whispered. I didn't know the ticket was legally hers. But you did know it was purchased with her money, Martin said quietly. And you knew she'd been supporting your family for years. Yet when you claimed the prize, you had her removed from the home she'd been paying for. Judd spoke for the first time. Mom, I'm so sorry. I didn't know about the ticket. I didn't know any of this. I looked at my son, seeing genuine remorse in his eyes for the first time since this nightmare began. But I wasn't ready to forgive him yet. He'd chosen Yara over me when it mattered most. Here's what we're prepared to offer, Martin said. Mrs. Holloway will accept the full $8 million lottery payout, minus taxes. In exchange, she won't pursue criminal charges for fraud or seek repayment of the $342,000 she invested in supporting your client's family. Richards looked relieved. That seems reasonable. We're not finished, Martin interrupted. Mrs. Holloway also wants the house. The room went dead silent. The house she's been paying for. The house where she invested 3 years of mortgage payments. Your client can buy her out at fair market value, or Mrs. Holloway will take possession. We can't afford to buy her out without the lottery money, Yara said through her tears. Then you'll need to find somewhere else to live. I watched Yara process this, seeing her realize that she was about to lose everything. The money, the house, the comfortable life she'd built on my generosity. There's one more thing, I said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. I want my filing cabinet back. All of it. Every document. Yara nodded miserably. It's in the garage. I was scared you'd find something that would prove I owed you money. You do owe me money, I said calmly. You owe me $342,000 plus 3 years of my life. But I'm willing to call it even if you agree to these terms. The negotiation took another hour, but the outcome was never in doubt. Yara signed papers transferring the lottery winnings to me, along with the deed to the house. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue criminal charges. As they prepared to leave, Judd approached me hesitantly. Mom, can we talk? I know I messed up, but maybe we could— No, I said quietly. We can't. He looked stunned. But I'm your son. You were my son, but you chose her over me when I needed you most. You stood there and watched her throw me out of my own home, and you said nothing. I was confused. I didn't understand what was happening. You understood enough. You just didn't care enough to defend me. I gathered my papers and stood up. Goodbye, Judd. 6 months later, I was sitting on the porch swing of my house, legally mine now, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The $8 million was safely invested, earning enough that I'd never have to worry about money again. Yara and Judd had moved into a small apartment across town. I'd heard through Margaret that Yara had finally gotten a job at a call center, working 40 hours a week for the first time in her adult life. Judd was still at the warehouse, picking up overtime shifts to help pay rent. They'd asked Margaret to see if I might be willing to let them visit, especially for the kids' sake. But I wasn't ready for that. Maybe I never would be. I'd learned something important during those weeks in the hotel room. I'd spent so much of my life trying to be needed, trying to prove my worth through what I could give other people, that I'd forgotten how to value myself. The money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was understanding that I didn't need anyone else's approval to have worth. I didn't need to buy love or earn affection through sacrifice. I was enough. Just me, by myself, was enough. Margaret came by that evening with a casserole and gossip from the neighborhood association meeting. Yara asked about you again, she said as we sat on the porch together. She wanted to know if you seemed happy. I thought about that question. Was I happy? I was lonely sometimes. I missed having family around, missed feeling needed, but I wasn't bitter anymore. I wasn't angry. Tell her I'm content, I said finally. That's more than I ever was when I was trying to make everyone else happy. Margaret nodded. You look different, peaceful. She was right. For the first time in my adult life, I was living for myself, making decisions based on what I wanted, not what other people needed from me. It was a strange feeling, but not an unpleasant one. As I watched the stars come out that night, I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years ago, desperate to be useful, to matter, to have purpose. I'd found all of those things, but not in the way I'd expected. I mattered because I'd stood up for myself. I had purpose because I'd chosen to value my own dignity over other people's comfort. I was useful because I'd learned to use my resources wisely, for myself instead of for people who took my generosity for granted. I'd paid a high price for those lessons, but as I sat in my home, truly my home now, I knew it had been worth it. Some people might call what I'd done revenge, but it wasn't revenge. It was justice. And sometimes, justice looks exactly like an old woman sitting on her own porch swing, finally free to live life on her own terms. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.